many times where people, as I said, 3 of you are already doing some hypnotherapy, and this is very much about helping people to incorporate this into their practice. For other people, it's just out of interest, which is fine. I won't talk about myself because I've already done that as a filler while we were trying to sort things out. But what I will say about this slide, it's the most crowded slide on the whole thing, but this is really just to let you know that we actually work in association with a whole bunch of different professional associations, some of which are British. This one down here is Canadian. The Complementary and Natural Healthcare Council is the body in the UK that governs hypnotherapy and certain other professions. We've got NCP, ICP, that's the National Council for Psychotherapists, and also the International Council. And this particular course that I'll be mentioning at the end, I'm here to talk about CBT, but I will refer to the next course when we finish. That one is actually accredited by a number of bodies, including the Open College network in the UK. So we are big time into certification that's actually internationally recognized, because I found there was an issue in the Middle East often where people have what we call Mickey Mouse qualifications. They're not ones that are accredited or recognized internationally particularly. And you don't have to believe my my story when I tell you that we're good, we do a good job. But actually this picture here is one of 2 occasions where we were honoured with the School of the Year, and you can see us standing posing outside the Ritz Hotel in London. They're receiving one of these awards, and the awards are from around the world, not just from the UK, but there are a whole bunch of accredited schools that work with the professional associations, and we have twice been selected by the great and the good as having the best school in the world. So we're quite proud of that achievement, and that's based on the quality and the quantity of the graduates that we've trained. I should say, that's Terence Watts, if you didn't read the word, who's the principal who founded Essex Institute. He's the chair of the Association for Professional Hypnosis and Psychotherapy. He's a freeman of the City of London, on all sorts of medical councils and various things. And he's a great ballroom dancer in his time, but he says he's past it now. So that's Terence Watts. So I want to just ask you, I won't spend too long on this one now, but I just want to get a couple of points across to you clearly. What's the difference, if I bring this in and do a short version, what's the difference between a psychiatrist and everyone else on that list, which includes hypnotherapists, psychotherapists, any kind of counsellor, psychotherapist, etc., coaches, blah, blah, blah. Okay, what's the difference between a psychiatrist and the rest of them?
Psychiatrist is the certified doctor, like they are medical doctors.
Medical doctor. And what does that mean that they can do that nobody else on that list can?
Prescribe medicine.
Yes. And I'm going to say something contentious now. I'm happy to discuss it later in questions and answers. But I'd say that's what makes them often a real problem for mental health, because there has been a trend over the last 50 years to treat mental and emotional problems as if they were the same as physical illnesses, and they're not. Of course, there's a big mind-body link, and someone who's physically sick, that's going to affect their state of mind, their emotions, and so on. And similarly, someone who's very unhappy and very stressed can have all sorts of stress-related illnesses. But whereas there is an etiology, there's a bacterium or there's a virus, there's something you can identify, something not working in the body, you can say that is an illness, right? That's a condition. The problem is that mental health, the working of the neural pathways, all this, we're really just scratching the surface of that nowadays with the development, which is very exciting, the development that we're now having of you know, studying the brain, actually studying something more about neurology, knowing more about how the mind works, but it's still in its infancy. And the problem is giving drugs to people does not actually help them to deal with the things that cause them, mostly their mental health problems. So that's why we have to make that distinction. A mental health or psychiatric nurse might actually might give the patient the medication, but it has to be prescribed by the doctor, as someone quite rightly chipped in. I think, was that you, Rita? Because you worked in the pharmaceuticals at one time, so you know that.
Still working in the pharmaceutical.
Still are, fine.
Yes.
So we'll forgive you. I will forgive you as long as you're not forcing people to take.
That's why I'm here, because I believe in what you say. That's why I'm here.
I'm sure. You know, seriously, there is a centre in Dubai. I don't know if you know it. Something, Tai Chi House of Om, something like that. And the guy who runs it is a lovely guy. He's a Syrian guy. And whenever I've seen him, he's all been dressed up very sort of hippie or traditional Arabic or whatever. But he actually is a financial director in a big pharmaceutical company. And I think that's his way of making up for what the company gets up to. He runs all, everything is free, you know, it's all free meditation, free visits to the desert. Everything he does is freebies. We've done some freebies for him ourselves in the past. And as I said, he's a lovely guy. But I was really surprised when I heard what he did for a living, because it just didn't fit with the whole, if you see this place, if you've ever been, it's behind the old Dubai Zoo. As I said, it's a great place, and it really looks like it belongs in California in the 60s or 70s, you know, it's that kind of a place. So yeah, so the problem is that people take meds as if they were sweeties, and I'm not saying it's, I mean, I think the psychiatrists and the doctors and pharmaceutical companies bear the main responsibility for this, but also people are very sheep-like. They'll do what they're told, especially if someone's wearing a white coat, an authority figure telling them what to do, and they want a pill to fix everything easily. They don't want to work at actually understanding their mind and their brains and so on. And so, you know, at the moment we're in a situation where I think in the world we've got a real problem, because people aren't expressing their opinions or discussing them or having debates. It's all very fear-based. So if you like, we're kind of the opposite of that. So I won't go into what the other roles are because of timing, and I want to focus on the different strands in psychotherapy and how CBT fits into that. So here, just for simplicity's sake, you've got 4 different psychological approaches. And this one, I'm going to refer to as deficit psychology. There's something wrong. There's something wrong with people. They've got problems. They're messed up. And if you've ever read any Sigmund Freud, again, our students have to. There's a compulsory Freud book on their reading list. I don't know if those of you who are doing the ECHA course do, but the one our students have to read is the Psychopathology of Everyday Life. And it's the most relevant to hypnotherapists, because it talks about repression mechanisms, how we disguise things, how we have how we put memories, what he calls screen memories, over, that we allow ourselves to remember because we don't want to actually focus on the terrible thing that happened or the unhappiness that we had. But Freud had a pretty dim view of human beings. You know, he regarded humans as being cannibalistic, warmongering, incestuous beasts, basically, and that we needed society to keep us under control, to make us behave ourselves. But the problem was, according to Freud, that sometimes we got too controlled, too repressed, especially the sex instinct, and therefore we start becoming neurotic. So Freud's talking therapy was what he developed, but many people, again, I don't know if you hypnotherapists have been taught this, but actually, well, I'll ask you, do you know what the first thing that Freud ever learned and practiced as a psychotherapeutic modality when they were just inventing psychotherapy at the end of the 19th century? Anyone know?
Hypnosis?
Yep. So was that a guess, or did you know about that?
I've watched a documentary on that, actually.
Ah, excellent, excellent. So yes, Freud went and studied with particularly some of the French neurologists. They were all neurologists, by the way. Freud was a neurologist. He wasn't a general practitioner. And there was no such thing as psychiatry. That's a label that's been developed since then. So the group of people he worked with, most were medical doctors, but some weren't. And hypnosis had been practiced as a discipline by doctors in the 19th century quite a lot. Those of you who are Indian might have heard of James Easdale, who was a Scottish doctor who worked in India. And he was so successful using what they then called mesmerism to actually put people into trance states. And then he would do amputations, remove tumors. And he was so successful, he lost hardly any patients, so they gave him his own hospital to practice this in. So it was very much a normal thing in the 19th century, but you'd never know that now, right? Because it's one of those things that the history books just don't tell you about mostly, unless someone makes a documentary like the one that you saw. So Freud actually practiced hypnosis for about the first third of his career, and people mostly don't know that. And it was actually from doing hypnosis that he got the idea of repressed memories coming to the surface, what we in hypnotherapy called regression, okay? But then he said himself, this was what he said of himself, he wasn't very good at it. So he changed and he started developing what he called the talking cure. But as I said, he had a pretty dim view of human beings. Now we have where the roots of CBT lie are actually in behavioral psychology, and behavioral psychology is basically just saying, look, there's something going on and we need to observe it. So it's very much about observing human behavior, noticing what responses are in different situations. But when it started out, it was very, very what we would call nowadays deterministic, reductionist. It basically regarded people like animals, that you do experiments on them and you see what happens. You probably heard of Skinner, sorry, not Skinner, but I'll show you Skinner in a minute, but you probably heard of Pavlov, and I'll mention him in a bit. The Russian guy who did all the experiments on dogs and developed his theory of the conditioned response and then proved that there is a conditioned response, etc. Now we've got, it gets a bit more cheerful, there's something right. And this is what we call psychology of being, or humanistic psychology. And a famous proponent of this was Abraham Maslow, and then it came to be Carl Rogers, who you may have heard of, person-centered, client-centered therapy. But the difference between Maslow and these other guys was he said, look, if we want to understand people, their personalities, their minds, how people function, why do we study sick people all the time? Why don't we study people who are normal and functioning well? And you probably come across Maslow's pyramid of needs, you know, where he shows at the top the self-actualization, the desire to find out a purpose and a meaning in life. And down at the bottom, we've got the survival needs, and then we've got in between social needs, esteem needs, etc. So Maslow, believe it or not, was the first person to say, shouldn't we study just people who are functioning normally to find out more about humans, rather than looking at people who are in mental institutions, insane asylums, who are, you know, in a really bad way. And then we come to what we have now, which is very much the place that Phil and I belong, if you like, is what we call positive psychology, which has only had that label since 1998. So it really is a very new discipline. It's only just over 20 years old, but it incorporates all the best stuff of what's gone on before. But the focus, and Martin Seligman, who wrote a very famous book called Flow, flow states that top athletes have, or musicians get into, where everything just seems to flow easily, and the study of happiness. So there are other forums that I can talk about that, but basically just see that CBT's roots are here, but it can incorporate all of this here. What it doesn't tend to do is focus on what's wrong with people. It's much more interested in finding out, building on the positive side of people's personalities and helping them to sort their problems out. Now, just a couple of other people that I think probably several of you will have heard of been doing the hypnotherapy. Again, I'm not going to read all this out, but Milton Erickson, he's also, he was a psychiatrist, a very interesting person because he's considered to be one of the best observers and calibrators of people, of body language and people and human beings. And he learned a lot of what he learned about life from being paralyzed with polio. They thought he was going to die. And in fact, his parents were told he wouldn't live through the night when he was a teenager, but he did. And he actually was completely paralyzed, couldn't move at all. And he taught himself to walk and to function by watching baby growing up in the house. I think it was his sister's baby, watching and observing what she did, and just over and over doing the same movements, learning to crawl, learning to walk, etc. And he ended up going to med school, becoming a psychiatrist, and then unfortunately had a recurrence, and the rest of his life he was in a wheelchair. But what he did was switch from using medication and drugs, the usual stuff, and actually started talking to people and developed what he called brief therapy. And very famous from the point of view of NLP, because any of you NLPers at all? Any of you done any NLP? Maybe you do. I don't know if you do any in your ECHA course or not. Okay, well, hypnotherapy and NLP are, I'll move up so I can see myself, so you can see what I'm gesturing. Okay, NLP and hypnotherapy go together like this, right? Any hypnotherapist who hasn't done any NLP really should, and any NLPer who's not learned anything about hypnotherapy will benefit from learning something about that, because Milton Erickson, in hypnotherapy we call it Ericksonian language patterns. In NLP it's called Milton model, but it's the same thing. It's talking to people in ways that put them into the relaxation response, in other words, into trance, into hypnosis. And he did that naturally and very, very well. And John Grinder, well, it was actually Richard Bandler that first of all really sort of developed NLP, but then he took his ideas to a linguistics professor, John Grinder, at the same university that he was studying psychology, and they came up with the whole system called NLP that was based on the work of Erickson and of Virginia Satir and also Fritz Perls, who were the top therapists of their time. If you're interested in that at all, come on one of our NLP introductory workshops that we do, because it's a whole topic in itself. You've just got a picture of them there. And just as I said briefly, that's Virginia Satir. No, that's Virginia Satir. No, that's Fritz Perls, okay, and that's Milton Erickson. So this is the system, NLP system, which is very complementary, as I said, because hypnotic language, talking to people in ways that influence them, putting them into a relaxed state, getting them to accept new ideas, etc. All of that NLP, that's its bread and butter. Okay. So I said I'll mention Seligman again. If you don't know how to pronounce that name, I'll give it a go, which is Mihail Csikszentmihalyi. And the only reason I'm able to say that is because I went on YouTube and there are videos telling you how to pronounce that name, because it's a very difficult name to say if you don't speak one of the European languages. And so it's all like that. So what they came out with in 1998 was a manifesto of positive psychology, which was about positive human functioning so that we'll have a scientific understanding and effective interventions to build thriving communities as well as individuals and families. And CBT works beautifully well within that context of positive psychology. So I just mentioned that because it goes with hypnotherapy and all sorts of other things. Whereas because it's originally behavioral, some people think, oh, it won't go well. It does. It goes really, really well indeed. And I speak as someone who's a specialist in both. And then there's all sorts of other healings, which, again, some of you might have come across. Anyone know about EFT, emotional freedom techniques, and meridian therapies? Some of you may have heard or read. Some hypnotherapy courses introduce people to these. You've got Reiki, access bars, theta healing. It seems to me, without being rude, but almost everyone and their aunt nowadays does some kind of energy healing work. People are very open to these ideas nowadays. And you've got traditional approaches, you've got intuitive, and there are also scientific approaches with that. We've got quantum healing. I expect most of you have heard of Deepak Chopra.
Yes.
Joe Dispenza, Dr. Joe, Dr. Bruce Lipton, many others. And what they're concerned with is what actually Bruce Lipton calls the biology of belief and the phenomenon of epigenetics. This is the idea that genes aren't just fixed in a way that's rigid, that's just to do with genetics passed on forever. Actually, we affect our genes by the way that we think and we feel. Moment to moment, our genes are influenced by our mental state and our emotional state. And the placebo effect, which of course is Dr. Joe's big thing, which is if a third of illnesses can be made better by people believing that they're being given a treatment when it's actually just a sugar pill, tells you something about the power of the mind to influence our biology, right? So again, all of this can be incorporated within positive psychology as long as there's a rigorous approach to it and it isn't just flaky, okay? As I said, I'm comfortable with all this stuff. I've studied some of them, I'm qualified in some, but and to train others in some, but I'm not ever going to advocate anything which is just someone's ideas which you can't demonstrate. Okay, so now if we go to CBT itself, its roots, interestingly, are actually in Greco-Roman and Eastern philosophies. So although I said to you before, behavioral, that's the tradition in psychology, these ideas have been around for thousands of years. What we do in CBT is what we call an inductive Socratic approach to reasoning. Probably most of you have heard of Socrates, even if you've never read his books or know nothing about him. Very famous Greek philosopher. And what Socrates was famous for was asking questions in a way that got people to notice their own contradictions, their own, I'm going to use a psychology word now and see if you can tell me what it means, cognitive dissonance. Anyone going to hazard a guess and tell me, what does cognitive dissonance mean? Chip in, doesn't matter if you're right or wrong, it's just to see if you have any ideas about it. It's a jargon word that people often use, and I like people to understand the words that are used as jargon so they know what they are in plain English.
It's like exactly what you said, to notice the difference between what we're saying and what we're doing. Like just how you were explaining, we may have a belief and an idea, and yet also believe in the contradictory idea.
Exactly. So, and it's not necessarily just a contradiction between what we think and what we do, but it's specifically, that's where the cognitive bit's in there, that we've got two conflicting ideas or sets of opinions or beliefs that we're running that are completely in conflict with each other. So that's clearly not helpful for people to be integrated, to be moving forward, to be congruent, to be true to themselves when they've got this cognitive dissonance. So Socrates used questions in a way that got people to really unpack and think about the logic and the reason of what they were saying, and he'd get them to the point where they'd realize the contradictions in their own thinking and their own belief systems. Now that is interesting, because what he did was, people generalize a lot, and in NLP we talk about deletion, distortion and generalization. So people generalize, and we need to, right? Because for survival, I can't stop and work out how stairs work or how a door works every time I have to walk downstairs or open a door, right? We have a general idea about how these things work. Once we learn to do them, we can usually generalize and make it work. Although occasionally, if you've got the idea generalized that doors open outwards, and sometimes you come to a door that opens inwards, you can have a bit of a tough time, can't you? Even if it says pull, you keep pushing because you think doors should be opened by pushing, and then it takes you a while to adjust, right? And there are many things in life like that. So fine, it's good to have that. However, the problem is that we also miss out on the detail and find out what's really going on because of the generalization. So I might say, you know, all tall people are rather proud of themselves. Now, it might be I met one tall person once who was proud of themselves and they really made an impression on me. But then I go around thinking, all tall people are proud of themselves, right? And in fact, of course, if I then am asked, well, tell me, how is it? Tell me about that. Just tell me about how, you know, what you've noticed about tall people that means that they think a lot of themselves and that they're superior in some way. And then I'll start describing that person. And then I might say, okay, so who else do you know that's like that, that's tall and is very full of themselves and think they're superior? And then I can't actually think of anyone. So that's been useful, right? Because I realize now I've been making a big generalization about something where I've only got one piece of evidence for it. Now, if I could come up with 20 examples of tall people I knew who were full of themselves and so on, you might say, okay, then that's possibly true. Could you just think now of any short people that are also full of themselves? And then I might go, oh yeah, actually there are. So now I've got to change, right? I've got to say, okay, I do know lots of tall people are full of themselves, but actually lots of short people are. So that probably means there are a lot of people who really think themselves superior in some way. Now, that might not sound dangerous to you, but the Athenian government was so disturbed at the fact that his students, Socrates students, were going around questioning the rules and the laws of Athens. They told him, either you stop doing this teaching and this philosophy, you've got to stop, or you've got to leave Athens, that's it. And he said, I'm never going to leave Athens, it's my home, I love Athens. And they said, well, if you stay, you've got to stop what you're doing or we'll put you to death. And he said, I can't stop what I'm doing, that's, you know, that's what I do, that's who I am. I have to seek out understanding and find the truth and so on. So you may know the story, but he was forced to drink hemlock, he was forced to drink poison, they killed him. So fortunately that doesn't happen nowadays when we're training people in CBT. But it might help you to remember when you're questioning people sometimes about their beliefs, why they get very angry and disturbed, because you're actually shaking the cage, right? You're stretching their comfort zone a bit. And of course, when you're a therapist, your clients are coming to you because they want to actually get better and improve themselves. So they'll probably tolerate you doing that. But I'm warning you now, if you go around doing this all the time to your friends and families, you're going to get punched a few times, or you're going to get no more invitations to go to parties. Okay, because people don't like being questioned too much. The poet T.S. Eliot once said, humankind cannot bear very much truth. And sad to say, there's a lot of that going around at the moment. So it's based on the Stoic philosophy. The Stoic philosophy. Anyone tell me what Stoicism is? What's a Stoic? If you say someone is a Stoic person, what might that mean about them? Anyone hazard a guess? Now, what about Hans and Rittik? Some of you watch documentaries?
No.
No. Rita, how about you? Okay, well, Stoic, I'll put you out of misery. there's probably a different word from it. Maybe in some of you have mother tongues that are different. So stoic is someone who is stoic, is someone who is kind of resilient. And in positive psychology, that word resilience is used a lot. Someone who's developed a degree of mental toughness, who's thickened their skin up enough that they don't fall apart when they have to deal with a crisis of some sort. So a stoic is someone who says, okay, the car's broken down. Now, what can we do about that? Where's the nearest garage? Maybe we need to push it up on the road. And the opposite of a stoic is someone who goes, oh my God, no, the car's broken down. We're going to miss out. We're going to be late for the meeting, or it's all going to go horribly wrong. And, you know, if they've lost their favorite pair of earrings, it's a major drama. So it's the opposite of that, right? The opposite of a drama queen, someone who's solid, you know, common sense, resilient, the sort of person that their village gets burned down and they're out there doing their best to find a place to shelter while they sort it out. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. And then you've also got the four humors theory of personality, which was used originally in the first kinds of medicine in the West, which is this idea that you are one of four types. And although people laugh at it now, there's actually a fair bit of it in Jung's psychology and in things like personality tests. If you've ever had to do a psychometric test and so on, there's a lot of this in it still. The idea of being a person who's sanguine or a person who's choleric, etc. But I'm not going to go into that right now because of timing. So this tradition of the Stoic philosophy is based on Jon Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction program, which is a master's at Oxford University in the UK, which incorporates Buddhist mindfulness practices and meditation techniques. So actually CBT in recent years especially is not only behavioral psychology, but it's kind of brought in what's becoming more and more known as mindfulness, which is actually a form of Buddhist meditation techniques. And the most recent form of CBT is something called dialectical behavioral therapy. And what this does is it takes what we call standard, which I'm going to go through some of with you in a bit, cognitive behavioral techniques for regulating emotion, for reality testing, and it then combines that with concepts of resilience, okay, distress tolerance, acceptance, and mindful awareness. So again, it draws on Buddhist meditative practices, and what it does that's a bit different from the original CBT is CBT is all about change and helping people to change into the sort of person they want to be, build on the parts of them that they want to strengthen, start to do a change and get rid of the things that are holding them back. But DBT says, hang on a minute, we need a bit of a balance, because before someone can change, we might need to encourage more self-acceptance. Just accepting yourself for who you are and then thinking about how you want to change. And it's also true that many people do freak out if you try and encourage them to change too quickly. They just can get worse rather than better, because their tolerance for change, their comfort zone is very tightly held around them. So CBT says we need to actually, you know, let people take their time. This particular approach in CBT spends more, puts more effort and energy into self-acceptance. So if we go right back to the days of the Buddha, and by the way, let's remember that Buddhism is not a religion, although it's down as one of the 5 major religions. Does anyone know what Buddhism actually is? Hopefully some of you from India might know some Buddhists if you're, or a bit about Buddhism, but what is Buddhism if it's not a religion? I know people treat it as a religion.
Like I'm not from India, but I have an idea that it is about mindfulness more than a religion.
It's actually very specifically a philosophy and a psychology. It's a system of philosophy and psychology. So the fact that we have a Buddha that people worship and everything, actually the word Buddha comes from Buddhi, which is someone who is enlightened, someone who's realized, someone who's understood the impermanence of things, has practiced non-attachment, as you say, has practiced mindfulness. And so that's what Buddhism is. So I just mentioned that because people often get the wrong idea. They pray to Lord Buddha for this, that, and the other. And what Buddha, again, there's actually a site you can go to called Fake Buddha Quotes, because lots of people quote Buddha. and actually, as far as we know, everything, like most of the masters that have been around, it's not them that writes down their teachings, it's their students and their followers. But the Buddha is supposed to have said, believe nothing I say, weigh my words like gold, believe nothing I say, and work out your own salvation. In other words, he was the opposite of someone putting himself up there as a god to be worshipped. What he was doing is saying, look, I found this works. This is what I found by doing this. This happens. Try it out for yourself. See what happens. Make it work for yourself. But in this quote here, which is one that seems to fit with Buddhist philosophy and psychology, we are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts, and with our thoughts we make the world. Now, that isn't too far away from the philosophy of the, if you like, law of attraction. I find The Secret a little bit shallow and very focused on material things, but you know, that idea that what we think about is what we tend to attract has become very popular in recent years, right? So that's actually an application of Buddhist philosophy and psychology. So I said I'd come back to these guys briefly in the beginning. This is Pavlov, the Russian that I mentioned. And in the training we do, we show other pictures, which I'm not going to show today, but these poor dogs, you've probably heard about the dogs. Anyone remember the story? Know what Pavlov did with his dogs?
Yes. He rang the bell before giving them the food once, twice, 3 times. And then after that, it's just the bell without the food. And he saw that they still had saliva as if there is a real food. So there is like a connection between the bell and the food.
So he set up a response, a conditioned response, and in NLP we call that anchoring, and we do it for positive reasons to involve positive states. But of course, people are anchored by negative states a lot of the time, and we have to help them to change that. So, and by the way, with a diagram I'm not going to show you today, I've got a diagram of someone that made diagrams from what they did, and they actually had these buckets underneath the poor old dogs, and the dogs were hanging in a sort of a strap thing, and they actually measured the amount of saliva that they dripped into the buckets to prove that they were still producing saliva after they weren't giving them the food, after they'd conditioned them. And this guy came after him. This guy is Skinner, and he was even more extreme. And what I find, and many of us in the field find worrying about Skinner, is that he basically took all the idea about animals and put them onto humans, and was what we would nowadays call a radical atheist. We have a guy nowadays who you may have heard of called Richard Dawkins, who wrote a very famous book called The Selfish Gene, and he's a radical atheist too. So it's all about making fun and pulling apart the arguments of anyone who has a belief in a higher deity, in God, in a higher form of consciousness and things like that. And so Skinner thought that basically people were like animals. He did his own research. He did it on pigeons, and he actually wrote a book called The Religious Behavior of Pigeons, believe it or not. He actually wrote that book. And what he did was study pigeons, and he got pigeons when they were doing certain movements, you know, like, I'm not going to try and be a pigeon, but when they do this sort of pecking, and then when they did the pecking, he would get them fed the grain through a feeder. So after a bit, they would come up and do this because they obviously thought that if they did that, they'd get food. So he said, this is what humans do when they go and do prayer, when they go to church or the mosque, when they do rituals. It's just like pigeons. It's actually based on no logic whatsoever. It's just blind faith that they have. So he was quite extreme. And the thing about, I suppose you could say what was good with him was that he did do experiments and measured things, but what wasn't very good was that they used a lot of his ideas in things like brainwashing people, in, you know, a lot of psyops and manipulation, mass manipulation. If you're interested in these topics, by the way, there's an excellent documentary. I don't know if any of you've seen it already. It's in 3 parts, but the first one is the must-see if you're interested in the field of psychology and therapy, and it's called The Century of the Self. And it's a BBC series that you can still see, I think, on, if you can't see it on, if it's not on Netflix, it'll be on YouTube. And it basically goes through the 20th century and shows how so many of the ideas that are used now in mass marketing, advertising, brainwashing techniques used by governments and politicians. I won't go into detail about this, but in the last year, if you're a psychologist who knows about this stuff, it's been absolutely fascinating to see how it's been used to manipulate populations to comply with what they're told to do. So if you're interested in what makes people tick, then I recommend that for you. If you ask me later, I can always put it in the chat box. So then we move to a guy called Volpe, and we have systematic desensitization. And this is unlearning fear. So it's basically, you know, if you're terrified of a cockroach, this would be this approach. Okay, we start out by getting you to sit down, relax, and we show you maybe a picture of a cockroach, at a distance and teach you to breathe and relax as much as you can without freaking out at the picture of the cockroach. Then we might make a bigger picture. Then we might actually introduce a cockroach in the room, but in a cage, so it can't get out, whatever. So we gradually desensitize you to the cockroach. Okay, that's the theory behind that. And he also did something which he developed, something called assertiveness training, which is something that I also teach, which is basically teaching people how to change their own behavior, not by governments or psychologists or marketers or whatever doing it, but by doing it for themselves, by changing their behavior and practicing behaving differently, which is a great way of doing things. We've got the Lazarus multimodal approach. If you're into EFT, that's where the term SUDS comes from, the subjective units of discomfort or disturbance, and then various other people in their research, which I won't go into now. So here are the two people that we can thank for modern CBT. Now, just briefly, you can read the stuff. I'm not going to go into detail on it, but what I do want to say is that neither of these guys knew each other, worked together, or had anything to do with each other until right towards the end of Ellis's life. Beck is still with us, believe it or not. I think he's 101 or 102 this year. He's 102 this year. He's still working, semi-retired, and his daughter runs the Beck Institute. Now, here's the main difference. Ellis was a psychologist, and so he did a degree in psychology, and then he found that theory wasn't enough. He wanted to help people, so he trained in psychoanalysis, in psychoanalytic Freudian style therapy, okay, psychotherapy. Beck was a psychiatrist, and he felt that also medications and all that, you know, really weren't the best way to help people understand themselves. And particularly he worked initially a lot with depressives and people suffering from depression. So he also went and trained as a psychotherapist. And again, I didn't say this in the slide where we looked at what's the difference between psychiatrist and others. People often assume that a psychiatrist is trained in psychotherapy. They're not. If they do that, it's either because they went to a med school where they had some training on that, or most often because they chose to go and do training after they got their psychiatric experience. And of course, they gain their experience in psychiatric hospitals and wards where people are on medication, and they don't get exposed to the idea of changing by changing understanding and behavior. So both these guys did that, hoping to help people, and both found that psychoanalytic theory hasn't really got a body of evidence for it. And if anyone wants a good example to help them remember this, humor often helps you to remember things. Woody Allen, you might know forget the allegations of abuse and everything, but just as a filmmaker, a maker of films with comedy, Woody Allen, he's afraid of powerful women. He has a fear that he has a small penis. He's very afraid of death, and he has been since he was a young man. He's been in therapy for virtually his whole life. He understands the problems very well, intellectually, absolutely. And he can make funny movies about his hang-ups and his problems, right? And he used to act in the earlier ones as well, not so much more recently. But is he still has he still got those fears? Has he still got those neuroses? And the answer is yes. He would say so himself, right? So it helps people to understand themselves better. They understand intellectually what their hang-ups are, their problems are, but it doesn't necessarily make them any better. And I think that's true myself of many forms of therapy and counseling that have been practiced over the years, because people need tools, techniques, they need structure, they need ways to help them understand themselves because they didn't get it when they were growing up, right? Emotional intelligence is not taught on the school curriculum. Most parents aren't taught to be really good parents before they get pregnant. So we don't really have role models for this stuff. We have to actually learn it. So they found that it wasn't helpful, and each of them in their own way started to develop more structured way of conducting therapy that help people to actually understand themselves better and do something about it. So you can see Ellis helped people to understand that their core irrational beliefs led them to having emotional pain and to catastrophizing, etc. Beck, he developed a number of ways of measuring the severity of depression and suicidal ideation, anxiety, and more recently, in recent decades, well, not just recent years, decades, because it's quite old, he's been working with schizophrenics and finding that it's very helpful in working with schizophrenics as well. So what he developed was a system of what he called cognitive processing, changing, can you see that similarity? Negative thought patterns, and he called his system cognitive therapy. And it's been pushed quite hard because obviously he's still alive, whereas Beck died quite some time, Ellis died some time ago. But if you look at their work, very, very similar concepts and ideas and techniques. And this picture here shows them, this was actually the first time that they met. They had an evening in conversation with the two of them, and they found that they had really a lot in common. They found it really interesting to listen to how the other had come up with very similar ideas. And they agreed it would be helpful to start collaborating and having more meetings and looking at what they were each doing. Sadly, Ellis, although he looks, youngish, he's actually the older of the two. He died shortly after this meeting, so they never were able to continue. But as I said, Beck's still going strong at the age of 101 or 2. So common features between them are focus on the here and now, being more directive and guiding, not telling people what to do, but actually encouraging them, guiding them, giving them specific tools, things to practice and do, and structuring the psychotherapy sessions and helping to alleviate both the symptoms and the, addressing the patient's vulnerability, helping them to become more resilient. And this is what we call the cognitive triad just because it's got 3 quarters to it, of cognitive therapy. And that is thoughts, which is what we think, which affects how we feel and act. Emotions, how we feel, which also affects what we think and what we do. And behavior, what we do affects how we think and how we feel. So this is a loop that goes both ways, but the order that CBT takes them in is thoughts, the feelings, and the behaviors, and how that feeds back into the loop of both either a positive self-fulfilling prophecy of positivity or a negative spiraling down. Okay, so as I said, it's not rocket science, it's actually very simple, and that's why many therapists like it, find patients, and if they're working in the medical field, if they're working privately, their clients find it really useful because it's easy to understand. You start realizing, this isn't some great big complex thing. If I can just take it and break it down bit by bit, I'll be able to start changing the way that I think, the way I feel, and the way that I behave. So cognitive in CBT is everything that goes on in our mind. So it also includes things like memories, images, thoughts, and attention. The sort of stuff in hypnotherapy that we would talk about being in the domain of the subconscious mind, right? In cognitive therapy, they all go together. Anything that's going on in our emotions, in our minds, in our brains, and our nervous system is cognitive. Behavior, everything we do, what we say, how we act, and also how we avoid action. So when we don't do something, that's also a form of behavior, and how we solve problems. And therapy, which is of course a systematic approach to combating a problem, an illness, or an irregular condition. And the central concept of CBT is we feel the way that we think, and then we act accordingly. So as you can see, that's pretty straightforward, right? But it's actually very helpful, and it can be obviously quite sophisticated and applied very skillfully, but that's the basis, the bottom line of it. Now, I'd like to say something about motivation here, because motivation is a really important part of CBT. When we work with clients using CBT, the first thing we say is this is a 50-50 form of therapy. And this is where it's different from the way that some people, for example, practice hypnotherapy, where they'll say, lie down, close your eyes, think of this, think of that, give them suggestions, etc. In CBT, the client is going to take 50% responsibility for doing what they need to do between the sessions to reinforce what's happening. Now, think about this, those of you who are hypnotherapists, this is what makes CBT extra powerful when added with hypnotherapy, because you can do the hypno, you can do the subconscious work, but you've got the client also doing the conscious work, and you can combine the two in the self-help tasks or homework that you set them. But CBT does set homework for clients. It expects them to be active participants in the therapy. And if they're not doing their bit, if they're not fulfilling their commitments, then you start challenging about whether they actually want to change. Are they in therapy because they do want to change? What's going on with them? So motivation is vital in this. And we have two kinds of, basically, of motivation. So what does extrinsic mean as opposed to intrinsic? Anyone want to, perhaps you know already, or you want to have a guess? What's extrinsic and what's intrinsic?
Extrinsic would be directed outwards, and intrinsic would be self-work, looking inwards.
Yeah, you're almost there. The extrinsic is not so much looking out, but basically being affected from what's outside, okay? Yeah. So whether you're conscious of it or not, it's what happens to you, right? And that's classic, the operant conditioning I mentioned of Skinner, you know, give the dogs the meal, do the ringing of the bell, then don't give them the meal. After a while, ring the bell after they're used to that, making that association. So this is where you get conditioned, right? And if you're a suggestible type, you probably know this from your hypnotherapy. There are basically three categories of people, roughly, okay? There are suggestible, who are highly suggestible. There are people who are suggestible, but not extremely so. And there's people who are quite resistant to the idea of suggestions and being told what to do. So if I give you a practical example, you're watching TV and there's a break and there's an advert for a soft drink, a Coca-Cola, let's say. A highly suggestible person immediately wants the Coke when they've seen the cool water, the refreshment you get from the Coke. Immediately they start craving a Coke. They're going to run out, get a Coke from the fridge. If they haven't got one, they might even send someone out or go out and get one themselves because they have to have a Coke, right? That suggestion is there, all that imagery is there, all that marketing has done its job, right? The suggestible person is the one who goes, might quite fancy a Coke. And if they've got one, they might have one or another soft drink, but they're not desperate about it. But yeah, sure, that's a nice idea. I'll have a cold drink. Then you get the reluctant or resistant person, as some therapists describe them, and they'll go, there's no way I'm having a Coke now. They're just trying to sell me something, right? And you know, if you're a good hypnotherapist, you can work with all of those sorts of people, but you have to use the right kind of language. And I was talking before, again, I don't know if you ladies who've done level 4, have you done any Ericksonian language, hypnotherapy, different kinds of hypnotherapeutic language? Have you covered Ericksonian language at all?
A little bit.
Okay, because that would be the person where you say to them something like, you might want to think about opening your eyes, then you might want to think about closing them. And when you're absolutely ready and comfortable with closing your eyes, you might like to do that, right? Permissive, indirect suggestions. With a person who's suggestible, you just say, okay, now take a deep breath and close your eyes. You don't need to dance all around the place about it, right? You just tell them what to do and they'll go along with it and do it for the most part, right? So extrinsic is when someone tells you what to do or puts pressure on you from the outside and you go along with it because you're motivated by what we would call sometimes, I'm sure you've heard of this one, the carrot and stick, okay? Yeah. So if we take our current situation, social shaming, right? Oh, you didn't wear your mask, or you sneezed, or you grabbed and hugged your grandmother, so this is terrible, you're going to kill people, so, right? It's social shaming. The carrot, oh, you're a good person if you come out and you clap for the health service, or you you put your contribution in the box, or whatever, you're a good person. So one's a reward based, one's a punishment based, okay? And the extreme would be physical punishment or torture, and the extreme the other way would be giving you anything at all, your heart's desire, what you want. Mostly it's somewhere kind of in between, not at those extremes. So that's extrinsic. And this is intrinsic. You quite rightly said that's what is on the inside, your own self-talk. Whether you stick to your New Year resolutions, whether you use your will to go out and keep repeating and going to that gym, or doing your daily gratitudes, or whatever it might be, okay? And you do that because you want to, you choose to. And this is to do with our thoughts, to do with our feelings. There may well be some biology in it. I'm not ruling out any genetic influence on our personalities. And it might be spiritual. It might be to do with a spiritual belief. Not necessarily, it could be religious, but it could be non-religious, but still a belief in something more than just this physical world and body. And then we've got conation, which a lot of people don't know what that is. And it's simply because most people have heard of cognition, thoughts, affect, the emotions, and conation is how you act on your thoughts and feelings. That's what conation means. Now, there's one thing in common between these two, and this is that both from the extrinsic pressure on us, like I was talking about, you know, social shaming, for example, what's it, fear of missing out, FOMO, I'm told by people who have teenagers. Thank God I don't have teenagers anymore. I've got grandchildren and great-grandchildren, but I don't have teenagers. But, you know, the pressure to be the same as everyone else, but that's also intrinsic. We want, as I said, not to miss out. We want to be accepted by our friends. We want peer recognition, and that's in Maslow's pyramid of need. That's kind of, that's in the middle there, you know. So this is, they both have that in common. Both we're influenced by the outside, but also we put pressure on ourselves to be good parents, good wife or husband, you know, good member of society, etc. So that's the only one they have in common. So obviously, if we're doing therapy, where do we want to see motivation coming from?
Intrinsic.
Absolutely. So that's why, for example, if you're doing smoking cessation, you need to do a thorough sort of check out before you take anyone on why they're coming to do quit smoking. Is it because they genuinely want to, they've reached a point in their life, they really just don't want to smoke anymore, it's affecting their health, they've got all sorts of good reasons, or are they coming because their wife nagged them to, or because they brought in a smoking ban at work and they don't know how they're going to cope with it, or basically it's coming from the outside. And you know, if you try to get someone to change and they don't really want to change, forget it. That is really crazy. You're not going to get someone to change that doesn't want to. There's a little therapy joke which you may not have heard. How many, there's the light bulb jokes you've probably heard of, you know, how many so-and-sos does it take to change a light bulb? Well, the therapy joke is, how many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? And does anyone know what the answer is?
None.
No, not quite. You put us all out of a job. Ideally, you put yourself out of a job eventually after you've been paid and done your work. No. But it's a good guess. It's one. Only one, but the light bulb has to really want to change. Okay? So remember that when you're working with a client, that it's them that has to want to change. So in CBT, we analyze and help the client to analyze and understand that we represent our experience into what we call self-schema. That's well-developed concepts which derive from our experiences and our interpretation of those experiences. And of course, those are very much influenced by our parents, our surroundings, our growing up, our authority figures, and so on. But the thing is that when we grow up, we don't just go, oh, well, that was okay when I was a child, but I'm an adult now, I'll decide how I'm going to be. We tend to carry how we've been as we've been growing up into our adult lives as well. And so we develop a self-image. So here's a couple of them. I'm a friendly person, a people person. Here's another one. I don't trust others, I'm shy. And the thing is, if that works for you and you get the life you want, having either of those, when you don't need therapy, right? Because therapy is for people who think they've got something wrong with them or something that's not going according to plan. They want to change it. So I'm friendly and a people person, that might sound fine, it's positive. But what if there's someone who trusts people so much that they get ripped off all the time? And they come in to see you because they've yet again been taken for a ride, yet another partner's cheated on them, someone stole their savings, you know, all sorts of things have happened to them because they've been so friendly and such a people person that they haven't actually got any kind of boundaries. They haven't looked after their own interests. They haven't used protection for themselves, okay? I don't trust others, I'm shy. Well, for some people that might be fine. You know, I'm reserved and I'm quiet and I'm shy. I like to just keep my head down and not trouble anybody. But what if that person doesn't have any friends? What if that person never gets invited anywhere and gets quite lonely? What if that person says, I never seem to meet anyone that I might have a relationship with? So then they might need to work on that self-schema, right? Make sense?
Yeah.
So what we do in CBT is help people to start organizing and directing the processing of relevant information through these schemata as packages of self-knowledge. Okay, let's look at these beliefs you hold about yourself and see where are they working for you and where aren't they. And the ones where they work for you, great, just get on with it. And where they're not, or you're getting the results you don't want, okay, what needs to change? So the client is very much learning to become their own therapist in the process. And then eventually, Oksana, they can say none, okay? I don't need a therapist anymore. But they usually need a bit of help to get there. So Beck's research showed that there was a significant correlation between the severity of someone being depressed and the degree of negative self-evaluation and pessimism that they had. And he came up with what he called the cognitive triad in depression. Remember, we looked at that cognitive triad: thinking, feeling, and doing, behaving, right? You remember that triangle we looked at? So in depression, what he says is the person has a negative view of the situation, right? They think negative things about them, about the situation they're in. They have a negative view of themselves and a negative view of the future. So how does it affect their feelings? It means they feel sad. It means they may well feel hopeless, helpless, that things are just going to get worse, not better. And then what do? Well, they'll often stop doing anything. They, you know, in extreme depression, someone won't even feel like they can get out of bed in the morning. They won't get dressed. They won't take care of their hygiene. They say there's no point. They can't find any purpose in life at all. So this cognitive triad, we look at whatever the person is coming to us with, in this case, depression. And there are also some people who reckon it's not just correlation, but we've actually got causation. We've got enough research now to show that that is a typical depressive view of life. So the purpose of CBT is to help identify thoughts and beliefs by self-monitoring and education in order to raise self-awareness and understanding of the relationship between the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And we also look at the stimulus. What was it at that particular moment that triggered me thinking that thought and then having that feeling? Okay, well, the boss came into the room. Okay, the boss came into the room. Oh, the boss hates me, might be the generalization, right? Boss doesn't like me, doesn't have a high opinion of me. Why do you say that? Well, because the boss, whenever the boss comes in the room, they give me a bad look. Okay, so let's go to a particular time when the boss came in the room and gave you a bad look. When was that? Well, it was yesterday. Okay, so what happened? Boss came in. And what did you think when the boss came in? I thought the boss doesn't like me. Ah, okay. So isn't that interesting? Because when you think someone doesn't like you, what happens to your own body language, to your own facial expression, right? What do you look like? What sort of face do you pull if you think someone really doesn't like you and that they're against you in some way? Do you smile happily and look all chirpy? You might put on a social smile, but your eyes aren't smiling, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so because we have intuition, because we've got sensory information that we're not even conscious of, the boss is well aware that you don't like them either, or you're scared of them, you're nervous about them. And so your thought has actually been stimulated by the boss coming in, but it's your thought, right? And then that leads to an emotion. Usually it would be fear or worry, you're going to lose your job, it's going to fire you one day, something like that, right? So we look to see in each experience, not what we're experiencing, but how we interpret it. And what we do with that information, that's what counts. So thoughts mediate between the stimuli, external events, and the emotions that we have about things. So there's the stimulus, elicits a thought, and then that in turn leads to an emotion. So it's not the stimulus, it's not the boss. Unless the boss is shouting at you or hitting you, it's what you do about that in your head, what you think and what you feel about that, that tends to evaluate what it means, right? It might be the boss is having problems at home. Maybe the boss has got regular migraine headaches, and so their scowling is not directed at you. In order to find out, that we're not saying that they might have it in you, they might not like you, but in order to find out reality checking, which is CBT is big on, right? Logic, reason, reality, then we need to do some analyzing of that. So it's not as simple as just going switch negative into positive like that. We have to do some analysis along the way. So clients are encouraged to notice and record their emotional states and the triggers, and to do things like keep a daily activity schedule, fill in forms, journaling, So clients are given work to do. I prefer the term self-help assignments to homework because a lot of people have got negative connotations with homework, being in trouble, teacher writing red ink all over your pages and so on. So self-help, but other people aren't bothered. So then you could use the word homework if you like. So changing the basic cognitions, the thought process causes the feeling. So if you have the thought, I'll never have a good job. Say we have a friend with us here who maybe he's not anymore with us because we're down to 4 now, but and I can't see everyone's name. But he says, okay, he's looking for a job at the moment. Suppose he's got the thought, I'll never have a good job. He starts to feel hopeless. If he's in a state of hopelessness, is he likely to look for jobs, fill in forms, go on LinkedIn, check out who's hiring? Is he likely to do anything to actually find a good job? A simple yes or no would do. If someone's feeling hopeless, are they likely to go out and do anything to help themselves get that?
Could you repeat the question? I had a very crappy connection here. Sorry about that.
Okay, I said, if someone has the thought, I'll never have a good job, and that leads them to feel hopeless, if we think about behavior, remember, thought, feeling, behavior, action, doing, are they likely to start looking for a job, to fill in the forms, to check out who's hiring, to make an effort to go out and get a good job if they're feeling hopeless because they have the thought, I'll never have a good job? Are they likely to make any effort?
No.
No, exactly. If someone has the thought, nobody likes me, and that leads them to feel lonely and rejected, are they likely to go out to parties, follow up with people, follow up on old friends that they used to have? Exactly. So then they're stuck in this behavioral loop, the cognitive behavioral loop of not taking the action they need to, and thus proving to themselves, yeah, see, I told you nobody likes me. But did you call anybody? Did you go out anywhere where you'd meet anybody? Well, no. So is that logical to say nobody likes me? Well, no. You're getting people, remember, to come to find out what are their cognitive dissonances, where are they in conflict? Well, I want to have friends, I want to have a social life, yeah, but you're running the thought, nobody likes me, so how are you going to do that? And then we have what we would call a positive cognition. Well, no one's saying I haven't got a problem, okay, but I have solved problems before. So if you know that you've solved problems before, and you start to think about which things you did solve a problem for, what did you do, how did you do it, that leads to a state of hope and feeling positive, right? So it's about reframing, and NLP uses the term reframing, and so does CBT a lot. So a CBT therapist's job is to aim to bring the client's depression back into the normal range so they can start to function more normally using a series of behavioral techniques. And here's where your hypnotherapy, breathing, checking out, experimenting, having an attitude of let's trial things, you know, actually let's have a go. Maybe they won't all work, but let's see what does. So breathing to induce the relaxation response. Those of you who are hypnotherapists can do lots of that kind of thing. Giving them a daily activity schedule, starting them to get to notice which things perk them up, which things bring them down. Pleasure ratings, using that SATS meter on a scale of 0 to 10, okay, how much does that upset you or distress you? Which things do you like? Which things don't bother you that much? So they start to get more of a sense, instead of black and white, on or off, instead of what we would call, here's another jargon word for you, dichotomous thinking. It's either on or it's off, it's black or it's white. You start to get analog thinking, you start to get a range, you start to get a rainbow of various colors, not even 50 shades of gray, but 50 different shades of color. And experiments including controlled exposure. I gave you an example of that earlier on. In that first part of the program, we have to identify and challenge the negative automatic thoughts and analyze the errors in logic which depressed people normally make. You can use the Socratic or inductive questioning I've mentioned and guided discovery to challenge and rewrite those thoughts in a more balanced way. Well, it's true that I've had a couple of people that really didn't like me, but it's also true that there's probably about 20 people I could think of in my life that I've had a good relationship with. Okay, so let's focus on that. Proportionally, how many people like you compared with how many don't? Well, probably it works out about 5 to 1. Well, that's great. And 5 sessions minimum to learn to identify and challenge the automatic negative thoughts and the things that trigger these. Now, when I say 5 sessions, I'm looking at 15 to 20 sessions in total using purely CBT. If you use hypnotherapy and other modalities along with it, you'll often get it down that you only need to do 5 to 7 sessions. And it also depends on how long your sessions are. So you encourage the client to think about what was going through their mind just before they started to feel that way. And the client and the therapist draw up a list of 5, 6, a few of the presenting problems and what are the likely thinking errors. So you really are starting to become a detective of your own mind, analysing forensically what's going on in my head. The client takes on the role of the observer to reality test these negative thoughts as hypotheses, as if they were looking at them from the outside. And there are lots of methods of doing that that are very useful in CBT. Alternative ways of thinking that can be substituted for the original negative automatic thoughts that are more balanced and reflect the client's experience more accurately. And if you're doing, again, I don't know what you're learning in your hypnotherapy course, but when we teach hypnotherapy, we incorporate parts therapy, ego states therapy, and parts therapy is a great way to combine hypnotherapy with CBT. And then another 5 sessions, again, this is just doing CBT to work with deeper core beliefs and schemas, the unconscious, and this is where the hypnotherapy and going into the subconscious mind can be really, really useful. And negative automatic thoughts are plausible because they're generated around specific themes. I'm not good enough, I'm worthless, I'm never going to change. So encourage the client to start capturing those negative thoughts. They can use a voice-activated dictaphone. Most phones have them nowadays. Personally, I prefer people to write things down. And again, I don't know if you know this already from your studies or any documentaries any of you've watched, but the brain uses a different part of the brain is used when you write than it does when you're just thinking about something. Because emotions live mostly on this side of the brain, processed on that side of the brain, if you want to encourage people to be more rational, logical, understand and analyze themselves, if they start writing, it actually switches more of the left brain on, so they're able to see things more clearly, logically analyze them. Whereas if they're in a state of emotion, they may not be able to think so clearly. So that's why writing things down, journaling, and filling in certain forms that you can give the clients and so on is very useful. So research, just a couple of things about research, and we're going to wrap up shortly. In the treatment of depression, we found that CBT actually changes the brain's chemistry without medication, and it is endorsed in the UK, for example, the NHS, and throughout the private sector. It's considered to be the go-to therapy of choice, and I think it's becoming more and more popular also in the Middle East. Beck and his followers have done hundreds of clinical trials, not only on things like depression, but even right through to more extreme conditions, so-called personality disorders like borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, sometimes combined with medication. And Beck is actually now saying that we know that at least in some cases, CBT has effectively cured people who supposedly have a condition that you can never get rid of, like schizophrenia. And there's been a study done in Canada where they used CT scans, they used cognitive therapy. And what they did was, they did use scans, but they did brain scans pre and post treatment. And what they found was that both clients and patients who were taking medication and those who just had the cognitive therapy did have changes in their brain before and after. In one case, pharmaceutical therapy, in one case, psychotherapy. But there was a big difference, and this I find really interesting. The antidepressants affect one part of the brain, but the CBT treatment affects another part. The antidepressants dampen activity in the limbic system, which is the emotional center of the brain, but the CBT calms the activity in the cortex, the brain seat of reason. And that's why CBT brings about lasting results, because it's actually from the top down rather than the bottom up. In other words, take away the drugs and the person has still got the same problems. Do the CBT with them and they're handling their problems differently. They're handling their emotions differently. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you're helping the client to become their own therapist by learning to actually observe and become mindful of their thoughts, their feelings, how that affects their behavior, and you can develop your own techniques, incorporate them into CBT. It's very flexible. And as I said, I wanted to just, before we finish, just do a little bit of a comparison for those of you who know about hypnotherapy. So what they have in common is that they're both structured, focused, and relatively short. One uses specific assessment and diagnostic instruments. Some hypnotherapists do, especially people like me who train more generally in psychotherapy, use an in-depth initial questionnaire, but some people don't. So some hypnotherapists don't do much initial assessment. If you're trained in personality theory as a hypnotherapist as well, you might well do some of that. Both identify the core negative beliefs, in one case using conscious processes, using inductive questioning, the other by using the subconscious and bypassing the conscious critical faculty, by which we do not mean the part of us that can do critical thinking. We're talking about the part of us that resists any kind of change, tries to find reasons why we shouldn't do this or shouldn't do that, consciously being critical of anything that threatens change, right? It doesn't mean that you become a zombie or stupid, as you know, if you're a hypnotherapist. What you do is just put aside that piece, that part that keeps picking things apart and trying to make sure that nothing comes and disturbs you in any way. We just put that in a state of relaxation so that we can talk directly to the subconscious. Reframing in both cases, one using conscious awareness, in one using parts therapy, ideally combining conscious and unconscious processes together. And both focus on specific thoughts, seek to change the negative or the positive thoughts. Both have goals for change, but CBT is more structured generally and goes in more for measuring and checking out from session to session what changes there have been. A lot of hypnotherapists aren't trained to do that. The ones I train do, but I know a lot who don't. Big difference here, again, the self-help, the homework, doing things outside the session on a daily basis, reinforcing new behaviors over time and controlled exposure. Some hypnotherapists do give the clients audios to listen to and all of that, but many of them don't and rely on immediate changes through the use of suggestions, instant cures or fixes, especially if you're using NLP. One uses suds and shifts measures, one sometimes does, sometimes doesn't. And the biggest difference is that CBT doesn't revisit the past or conduct regression. The focus is on the here and now and the future. As you know, hypnotherapy does conduct regression and analytic work if you're trained to do that. Obviously, some people aren't, so they just do simple suggestion work. And so one of the reasons I personally like combining the two is that sometimes the CBT does the job here, but there's still stuff in the subconscious that just seems to just stay stuck and doesn't just change because you're changing the behaviors on the daily basis. So this is why I love to have hypnotherapy to use with CBT, because then you could also work with the subconscious and check out if there are any emotional blocks or traumas that need to be released in order for the conscious mind to do its job properly. So both are active, both one's directive and one can be, both are time limited and structures, and both are problem solving and solution focused approaches. So, and there's evidence, we'd like to have lots more of it, but there's evidence already that adding hypnosis to cognitive therapy can actually improve a number of conditions. In this case, the research talked about here is anxiety conditions. So we need more research, but all the research that I've seen, and there is more now on things like checking out which works best with things like pain, what has the longer lasting results. And generally my experience is backed up by the research I've seen, which is that CBT helps the hypnotherapy to do its job for long term and with very little relapses. Not always the case for doing simple hypnotherapy, especially suggestion hypnosis on its own. So the CBT will change those maladaptive and rigid cognitions. It's client-centered if it's done properly and in the spirit of positive psychology, and it will deal with all those sorts of things which you can see. Many of those are things that hypnotherapy will tackle, but hypnotherapy is not so good on its own at dealing with OCD and eating disorders. CBT generally is far more effective when that's used as a modality with that. And yeah, there are a number of things where, as I said, I would say CBT can be more effective than hypnotherapy on its own, but also the hypnotherapy is a great addition to the CBT. So my last slide for you, and I'm quite pleased that we've only overrun by 15 minutes, because we actually had more than half an hour in the end that we lost before we could get the slides up. So thank you for being patient, those who stuck with it. The next course we're running, you can find all this on Illuminations. They've got, you can register through them. So we're holding it over 2 intensive weekends, one in February, one in March. The fee includes the UK exam and certification fee, so you get a certificate and diploma once you pass the post-course exam. It's not an exam in a classroom. You do it in your own time. You've got 4 weeks to hand it in, and if it's not of the required standard, then you can actually redo those questions, because we want you to understand what you're doing, not to penalize you. And this is just for people who are interested, who haven't trained or want to do more in-depth training in psychotherapy. That's something we're planning to start either later this year, hopefully, fingers crossed, if not early next year. So any questions or comments from those brave souls who've stayed around? I think we've just got Hans right now. So Hans, have you got any questions? If not, then that's fine. You don't need to stick around. And thanks for being patient, because as I said, that was a very delayed start, which I can only apologize for, the technology not being set up in the way that it should have been.
It was a very wonderful session, Dr. Leela. Thanks for sharing the information and knowledge.
You're very welcome. Thank you for attending. So if you're interested in any of the other seminars that I run, please do keep in touch and let your friends know about it too. And I hope that that's been helpful to you in understanding more about CBT, whether or not you're wanting to train in it as a subject or just out of interest. Either way, I'm glad you found it useful. So thanks for attending.
Okay, just one question though. From where can I get more information on the international diploma, the 2-year course? It says
keep posted. Have you got a? Let me just see. We should have a. Where's the chat? Hang on. Ah, there's the chat. Okay. Okay. So this is my email address, because at the moment, try again. Yeah. Okay. It's coming out now. Okay. It's Dr. Leila at transforminst.com. Okay. That is my email address. So if you send me an email to my email address, I can put you on the list of people who are inquiring about it, because at the moment, just briefly, we're going through a process where our professional association, I mentioned at the beginning, the National Council for Psychotherapists and the international division of that, are in the process of upgrading so that they will be directly registered at the top level of registration with what's called the Health and Social Care division of the Professional Standards Authority in the UK. So at the moment, we've got a few organisations like the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, the UK Council of Psychotherapy. There's maybe like no more than half a dozen. And then at the moment, we're accredited, but we have to go through the Complementary and Natural Healthcare Council. I don't know if you remember me mentioning them. Well, once the NCP ICP is fully registered and is at that top level, equal with all the top professional associations for psychotherapy, counselling, etc., then that's when we'll launch the course, and because we want the course to be accredited. So as I said, the earliest it will be after the summer, and the latest it will be the beginning of next year. But these processes, as you can imagine, especially with the whole COVID thing and so many people work remotely, that they're well behind in the process. We had thought it would all be done by now, and we could, we would be out there with the prospectus and everything. So it's, as I said, everything is sort of ready to go, but we need to get that accreditation first. But as I said, there'll be a prospectus. It's usually like about 20 pages, really detailed prospectus about what we cover in each module. Oh, and I should have said, this course will be online. Previously, we've done face-to-face, and we're not going to commit to doing that at the moment because it's just too dodgy. We can't afford to be in a situation, because now people are talking about the COVID lockdown going on until 2022. we couldn't really go through what we went through last year, which was coming over for a 3-week trip and ending up staying for over 6 months. So we're now talking to our bodies in the UK. Everyone's accepting in the current situation, the work will have to be done online. And as I said, that's actually going much better than I had expected. So does that answer you sufficiently for now, Hans? And that I will, if you send me your details, you know, because you're coming through Illuminations, so I don't have access to your details. But if you send me your details, I can let you know about that as soon as we have dates.
I will definitely share that.
Okay, great. And I should also say, as you've asked me about that, you've been kind enough to stay on. That is a 2-year course. Whereas before we did a diploma, then an advanced diploma, was very much the focus was on hypnotherapy, and then we introduced psychotherapy in the 2nd year. The reason it's called integrative psychotherapy and counselling is because it incorporates all from the beginning. It's person-centered, it's learning different kinds of psychotherapeutic approaches. A big part of it will be hypnotherapy and CBT, but we'll also be incorporating things like EFT, and some other modalities as well, breath work, etc. The only thing is with the breath work, we'll only be able to do a certain amount of breath work online. The really, really intensive breath work is not suitable for doing online, but everything else is. And so at the end of that 2 years, anyone who qualifies will be able to, if they wish to, they can actually register as a member of the NCP ICP, and they can be a student member for reduced rates even while they're on the course. And at the end of that, you will have a UK qualification that entitles you to work just about anywhere as a fully certified psychotherapist, integrative psychotherapist. Okay.
Yeah, wonderful.
Okay, great. So thanks again for coming, Hans, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.